Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Rational Standard. It's another insanely busy week behind us, and that's going to become kind of our motto here at The Rational Standard. I do remember a time, actually not too long ago, where there were weeks of relative newslessness. Those days are over, but as uh, our function is to kind of try and demythologize a lot of these things, especially this week with. Some people call it like a budget and the budget process, but I have my doubts. It seems quite unlike what we've had before. Um, so yeah, that's going to be the big topic today. It's our budget process in South Africa and Enoch Godongwana's complete abortion of that process throughout. I guess he's not taking well to multi-party government as an individual. But yeah, I mean, let's get into it. Morné, you are our resident economist, I would say. So why don't you start by giving us maybe just a little bit of kind of context? We did a little bit of this last week, but maybe just refresh watchers and listeners on where this process came from, how it started with the kind of postponement and the finance committee, and where we are today.
Yeah, I think that, we are now in the position that we're heading towards budget 3.0. So for the first time in South Africa's history, we had to postpone the initial release of a budget. And there was quite a bit of excitement about that, justifiably so. I think for the most part, for the better. It's good that we didn't go through with what was not a very helpful budget on the whole. A lot of spending increases, a lot of increases above inflation, and some excitement that this could have been the first time that we really saw the GNU, and in particular the junior partners in the GNU, showing some backbone and showing that they're willing to fight when it comes to reasonably serious matters, such as spending, such as taxation, and those sorts of things. So I think that's always positive. The fact that we've now had to remove the second version of the budget as well, I think is a sort of diminishing returns on these kinds of things. I think that you can handle some uncertainty, but you can't handle complete uncertainty. And I think to me the main issue isn't so much the outcome, which is probably on the whole not perfect, not optimal, but better than we would have had. But beyond the outcome, the way in which we went about doing and finalizing the budget just created so much uncertainty, and there still is a lot of uncertainty about the current status of, in particular, that VAT increase. So just to keep everybody up to date, the minister announced yesterday that the proposal of the 0.5 percentage point increase has been rejected and has been removed. But there's still a lot of uncertainty regarding how that's actually implemented and how that actually, and by when actually we'll see that reversal take place. And I think on the main part, just as a business person, the main issue is just the fact that, I mean, there's a lot of systems, in particular for large corporates and multinationals, that your payment processes are set up and they're not changed very easily. So there's a lot of capital that goes into complying with a change in VAT. You would have seen that, since the passing of that initial budget, you got a bunch of SMSs and emails and all sorts of things from everybody that you have a subscription with. And they all said, okay, accounting for the new increase, you're going to get a new invoice and so on. And you have, less than 10 days, just over a week between, okay, we've now updated all our systems, okay, we've updated our invoicing processes, our payment processes, and all those sorts of things. All that capital that you had to invest in terms of the initial announcement, that's all now gone. That's all wasted because you've had to spend all that money, but you're now having to reverse everything that you've done. So on the one hand, just all that wasted cost, and on the other hand, just what's the saying is that uncertainty is a tax, but doesn't create any revenue. So And so it's sort of the worst form of a tax. It's just the fact that we've had this uncertainty. On the whole, what it means politically, we can maybe delve into, but from an economic perspective, I suppose the way that they've gone about it has been, piss poor at best. But the outcome, I suppose, particularly in a medium to long term basis, is fairly positive. It shows that there is at least some some give when it comes to the decisions made by politicians. They're willing to take into consideration and willing to buck when placed under sufficient pressure. So yeah, I think it is good. I think a lot of people have been talking about the increase in debt that might occur because we didn't have that, but I think that's probably overblown. Edward Kieswetter announced just before the announcement of the reversal of the VAT increase that we actually had an over collection based on the budget for the previous financial year. So we'd actually had we got 10 billion more in revenue than we thought we would. So, I mean, there was the one justification that there had been for the budget increase fell away, or for the VAT increase fell away. So, yeah, I think, economically speaking, probably, it comes out in the wash. I don't think it was going to be enormous either way, but I think it might be good as a signal going forward that at least there is some openness to compromise when it comes to the budget decisions going forward.
Yeah, I think maybe one thing that would hopefully come from this is, I mean, you alluded to this, all the big companies, I think there were some notable exceptions. My ISP, for instance, immediately told me, don't worry, we're not raising your subscription fee. And I found that very good of them, very pro-consumer. But most companies did, in fact, start telling people, listen, we're increasing our prices. And hopefully, I think, as long as South Africa doesn't have an outright majority party, this budget is probably indicative of how things might be going from now on in our politics. That there is going to be some wrangling around the budget, and that companies should maybe pause before changing their systems, and maybe wait until something resembling a final decision has come out. I mean, you can't blame the companies. They're used to like 30 years of, well, the minister said X, and therefore that's what it's going to be. So it's new territory for everyone. But maybe this was a good lesson, and maybe that is going to help cushion a little bit of the consequences of uncertainty, because, as you said, now these companies have to kind of undo everything that they've been kind of working on for the last 2 or 3 weeks, and that's not great, but it's a learning process. David, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine the compliance burden of having to calculate 15.5% on every transaction? That's probably long-term going to save everybody quite a lot of mental energy, especially for mathematically challenged people like myself. But, I think obviously there's all of the uncertainty and the volatility and everything, but I think most South Africans will be pretty pleased that their VAT isn't going up. But yeah, there's overall the VAT picture is really onerous. I mean, the tax picture, right? I mean, even if you look at what it takes to qualify as a VAT vendor, I mean, that's stayed at R1 million as a threshold for many, many years. I think, if I'm not mistaken, over 15 years. So there is a lot of bracket creep in the system. When did Malusi Gigaba introduce the 15%? Was that in 2018 or somewhere around there?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah. And yeah, not to mention all of the bracket creep on things like personal income tax as well. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the overall tax burden is just way too high in South Africa overall. And this would have resulted in perhaps about 13 or 15 billion rand additional revenue per financial year, which is the equivalent. We calculated in one of our advocacy campaigns that's about the equivalent of the size of the Department of Sport, Arts and Culture. And I'm sure Minister Gayton McKenzie wouldn't like us for this. And actually, I mentioned it to him at an event where I attended, where he spoke the other day. And, I said, look, if you want to save on spending, then just eliminate your entire department. And yeah, he didn't really seem to agree with me on that one. I wonder why not. But yeah, there's, what is it, 31 or 32 ministries in the executive, a whole lot of deputy ministers, but then the departments themselves with all of the attendant bureaucracy. So yeah, so I think the political parties are falling all over themselves to try and own this as a win. I mean, it seems to me that the DA should be, as some journalists I saw on Twitter said, they should get their flowers, which is a bit of a grating term. But yeah, I mean, I know that I'm supposed to be a sophisticated political analyst, but I'm not quite sure how, for the likes of Action SA and BOSA, that this is a win for them, even notwithstanding their statements on social media. Maybe you guys can help me to understand what their position is. But I think I would like to see a lot more politicians talking about reducing expenditure. It doesn't really seem like anybody's talking about that.
Yeah, no, certainly not. I mean, I think for a few weeks in a row now, we've made the point, and I think we're going to get into it a bit later again, that we had this big kerfuffle about the budget, and everyone's talking about the lack of available money, but at no point does cutting spending feature in the discourse. It's like taboo, almost like speaking about cutting the NHS in England is a taboo. Like you just don't go there. And in the press statement, in the what would you call it? The GNU Plus press statement of yesterday with all the other non-GNU parties, the ANC made the point again. They want to protect the expenditure framework or something. So they want to eliminate tax VAT without bringing what they still call austerity kind of into the picture. So they're still very committed to not cutting any spending, or at least not in significant amounts. I mean, every now and then there's this big celebration about fiscal responsibility. We're eliminating 10 million here, and that department has 1.2 million rand in savings here, and it's like, okay, yippee. It's like, no. we want savings to the tunes of at least tens, but ideally hundreds of billions of rands is what's needed in South Africa. Like these peripheral so-called cuts. Really, they might indicate some integrity, which is always good, but ultimately it's politically and policy-wise useless. And
I think that
Morné.
Yeah, just as sorry, go ahead.
No, it's just a quick point from us. It's just that, I mean, we call them cuts, and we'd like to actually see tangible cuts, but at the moment, what government calls cuts is just, we thought we were going to increase the budget by 10%, but now we're only increasing it by 5%. So that's a massive cut. We thought there was going to be an extra 10 billion, and now there's only going to be an extra 5 billion. So we've really slashed that department to the bone. And I mean, just getting them to say that we're not going to increase spending by as much as we thought, they view that as austerity. And I think people just have to realize that when government talks about cutting spending, they just mean that, we thought we were going to spend an extra 10 billion, and now we're only going to spend an extra 8 billion. So we've cut 2 billion on last year's budget. So, I mean, it's not as though we're asking for something, absolutely ridiculous. And this is also something that's come up in the US, is just there was such a distortion in spending post-COVID that if you could even just go back to those 2019 levels, if you just went back to the trajectory you were on prior to the pandemic, it would be enormous. And it's the same thing in South Africa. There's at least 40-50 billion, I think, that you could recoup in expenditure if you just went back to the levels that you were at prior to the pandemic, instead of using that as the new baseline for spending.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Morné's point is great, actually, the last one on using the pandemic as a baseline for spending, because it has been crazy to see what has happened. I was watching the press briefing yesterday that the ANC had with like all the parties who agreed with it, and yeah, it was pretty clear from them, right, that like, I guess the good would be that they are willing to concede that the economy needs to grow. They need more revenue, but their thinking is that to fix our fiscal situation, we will have to grow the economy to get more revenue instead of like cutting. And I think it is both. You have to cut whilst also growing to be able to give yourself that room. But to them, it really doesn't register. And by them, I mean the NC and like all the other parties, because there's one thing that is of concern, right? It is who Musima Imani, I was listening to him, he has this idea. And yesterday in the press briefing, he even said that the Department of Trade Industry and Competition is working on this idea in the form of legislation. I'm interested to see it, but it is the taxing of gambling, right? And like putting a sin tax on gambling and then using that as a source of revenue. And I'm like, the thinking that should tell you the level of thinking in like among these politicians, even the so-called good ones. It's that like they don't really understand why we are in the position that we are in fiscally, because they think that they can just wave a magic wand of sin taxes and everything will be okay, right? It's a very idea. Well, yeah, I won't go in a tirade on syntaxes and how horrible they are, but yeah, our fiscal situation, man, it is somewhat depressing. Yesterday, I spent a lot of time just watching reactions from the DA and all of these political parties, and trying to understand where they were coming from. And yeah, what I learned, to David's point, everyone is falling over themselves to claim this as a victory. And in as much as David doesn't see the victory on the side of the parties like Bosa and Action SA, I don't see the victory. I see the victory on the side of the DA. It's just that politically they were, I think, outmaneuvered because there's no judgment that forced the executive to change. Like that is the ANC's entire position, is that the court case is not the reason we are doing this, because no judgment has been handed down. And there seemingly is no evidence that the ANC was trying to broker a deal with the DA after proceedings the previous day in the Western Cape High Court. So absent of that, parties like BOSA and Action SA can just say, yeah, like that entire process, you're always saying that it does not matter. It matters, and it is the reason that they changed their minds. And that's what they said in the press briefing. Pretty much when I had Fikile Mbalula speaking, all the leaders of the political parties, even this leader of the National Colored Congress, I think, I did not know that they had a parliamentary seat, but he was very, very animated in his speech against the DA and Helen Zille. So like for them, the thinking is that the process that they had said they were partaking in finally yielded results. The finance minister listened to them, and their inputs were taken into consideration, and as such, the decision changed. So yeah, but overall, of course, we love it when we don't have a VAT increase. I personally love it. The idea of VAT is crazy. I think I'm writing an article on the progression of VAT and how it has changed, right? So, well, outside from when it jumped from 10% to 14%, and then we had that 14% normalization, which I still think is pretty high. But I know there are people, well, that is why we had a proposed VAT hike. There are people who still think it is too low for a state like South Africa. And I find the very idea of VAT, right, when we have so many unemployed, like just abject poverty outside of any economic positions, to be pretty absurd, because it's the state just making things more expensive when they don't need to, and they could be looking for other sources of revenue. But on the other side, VAT is the only fair tax. So you have to try and balance that. But yeah, overall, glad VAT is not increasing. Politically, it should be interesting to see what happens, right? I'm interested to see who will come out of this looking the best. From judging from all the talk yesterday, the DA, even though it did good, I love their court case. I can't wait to read the judgment, because I think it will be great for our law. But like they were outmaneuvered a bit, at least in my opinion, because the people who had voted for the fiscal framework that had a VAT increase seemingly were telling people, or trying to tell people, that everything is okay. But if you look at it substantively, since there was no judgment, they kind of willingly changed their minds. So like they can say they spoke the truth, even though it probably was not the case. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, let's go into the politics of it a little bit. I mean, this is what I've been saying on social media since I guess the budget 2.0 was tabled, was that the public is being gaslighted at a kind of a very, very large scale, because well, I mean, this is budget 1.0, the one that was going to get, the one that was postponed. So we knew what was going to be in that budget, and I think it was a 2% VAT increase, I think, something along those lines, over 2 years. And almost immediately you had everyone, everyone, and specifically the ANC, the African National Congress, the party with 41% of the seats in parliament and which controls the presidency, the deputy presidency, and most of cabinet. They also opposed the VAT increase, and then when it went down to 0.5, the ANC again said that they opposed the VAT increase. And like, to us this is funny, and it is funny, and we should laugh about it because it's ridiculous. But the fact is, there are a lot of people out there who do not see the obvious kind of slap in the face that they're receiving. I mean, no, the ANC does not oppose the VAT increase. If the ANC opposed the VAT increase, they'd have fired Enoch Godongwana and put Des van Rooyen or someone in there and taken out the VAT increase. But no, Enoch Godongwana, card-carrying member of the ANC and member in good standing of the ANC's NEC, I think, as well, tabled the budget with his ANC policy advisors having written the budget, and his ANC colleagues on the cabinet having approved the budget, although they didn't get the sufficient consensus necessary for the budget to be approved by cabinet, and that's something we can get into a bit later. But ultimately, the ANC approved the budget, and after budget 1.0 and 2.0, the ANC tried to have its cake and eat it by saying, no, the DA is being regressive by opposing the budget, and they were joined by BOSA and Rise Mzansi and Action SA. The DA is being regressive, they're being reckless. But we also actually oppose the budget. We're just going to kind of follow a different way of changing it. So the impression that I think a lot of South Africans might have, and I really don't say this as an insult, because politics and policy appears very intuitive to us, but to many other people, it would be like Greek to me or science to me. I have no idea what's going on. And to them, it might really seem like the VAT increase and the budget came from somewhere. Like, someone came up with this thing. We don't know who, but like our politicians, our chosen representatives are out there fighting for us. ANC, EFF, MKDA, Action SA, they're all defending us against this VAT increase thing. When no, that is not how it works. This is an ANC budget through and through, and they at least, I mean, we're talking about who can claim victory. The ANC cannot claim victory. They are the ones who must kind of hang their heads in shame for having kind of proposed that budget in the first place. And in my Daily Friend column for this week, I specifically target the finance minister. I mean, he is the chosen one in our structure of government who must steward the budget process. He is the point man on this, and he really turned this into a pig's breakfast. And kind of I alluded to this earlier, it's kind of new multi-party politics, and we're not all sure always about how it's going to work out, but he must have had the presence of mind to understand we cannot just impose an ANC budget. I have to consult with the other partners in the GNU. And if I do not get sufficient consensus, which is at least ANC plus DA, then I must go back to the drawing board. And he pretended to do this, but then he came back still with a VAT increase and with an income tax bracket creep, and he still proposed the budget. So that's his first mistake. And then he tabled it in parliament without cabinet approval. So he, in my view, broke one of South Africa's most established constitutional conventions. Let me be clear. He didn't do anything illegal. This is not constitutional law, but it is a convention that before the executive can table a bill in parliament, like the appropriations bill and the various other budget bills, they need the buy-in of their cabinet colleagues. Otherwise, it's just a private member's bill. That did not happen this time. Enoch Godongwana went to parliament unilaterally with some cabinet support, but not the sufficient consensus that he required. So he broke that rule. Then, I mean, we alluded to this, Zakes. You just spoke very kind of eloquently on this. we have how many millions of unemployed South Africans? We have, I think, on average 1.2% economic growth. I even doubt that, but over the last 3 years, that is nothing. It is nothing, and still they tabled a budget that increased state wages. They'd increase state wages for a job well done, of course, and of course included VAT in these economic circumstances. And Gorongwana is the man who proposed that. And then the third thing, of course, is he's been lying. They've all been lying, kind of gaslighting the public. But Enoch Gorongwana repeatedly said that there is no alternative to that. I mean, that is just a lie. It's fine to have an opinion difference about, yes, we don't want to cut spending and we don't want to indebt ourselves further. That's fine. I acknowledge that we represent a relatively minoritarian view on this. Libertarians and liberals, we have to cut and slash everything. That's not a very widely held view. I can accept that. But to go out as the finance minister in front of the press and to speak to ordinary South Africans and to say that, there is no alternative to VAT. You're just going to have to bend over and take it. That is a lie. That is a simple lie. There are alternatives to that. Of course, there are alternatives to that. So yeah, these are the three things that I mentioned in my article that I think really create grounds for Gorongwana to resign. I think he really has made a balls up of this situation. I know there's not a list of better alternatives than he necessarily, but there must be some mechanism of accountability in our politics, I would say. And after this disaster, I think he needs to kind of eat some humble pie and say that he's kind of lost the confidence of the public, of the economy, I would say, by how he's handled this. So yeah, that's kind of my view on the political repercussions of this.
Azad, can Martin, to your point about Godongwana resigning, right? I think there's probably a journalist who had read your column from yesterday, because of the briefing they raised that question, like, will there be consequences for Godongwana? Or I don't know what the main other question was, but I heard Mbalula's answer, which was, oh no, the finance minister did a good job, delivered a budget, we aren't doing anything to the finance minister. The finance minister is gonna stay where he is. So yeah, as much as in a functional society that has good consequence management, Godongwana should have resigned after the first budget, right? After it was scrapped, that should have been it for him. But he seems like he will be trudging on probably for another 4 years. That is depressing to think about. But yeah, I only wanted to say that they raised it, and I don't think it will happen, unfortunately.
No, of course not. Morné, any thoughts from your side?
I've got a comment.
Sorry, yeah, David hasn't spoken for a while.
Yeah, look, I think you made mention of growth. And I mean, this whole debate around the budget has been premised on National Treasury's growth projection of 1.9% over the next medium-term expenditure framework. And the IMF has recently come out to say, well, no, they're projecting a 1% economic growth rate. And, all of this in the context of increased borrowing. So South Africa has a debt to GDP ratio of 75% that's pushing up within this projected cycle to about 76%. And all of these debates will be a lot less fractious and difficult if we had a higher growth rate. So, I mean, all of these ratios, the fiscal deficit, the debt to GDP ratio, even just in the language, debt to GDP, if you increase GDP, the size of the gross domestic product of the economy, then proportionately debt will come down. So that's the way out of this. So we can cut our way out, we can grow our way out, or we can borrow our way out. Borrowing is not an option because we're going to be creating an intergenerational crisis. Our children are going to be inheriting all of that debt. And I mean, arguably, this is all about politics and the horse trading, and everybody's trying to play status games. And all of this is because the chickens are finally coming home to roost with our fiscal situation. So we're really running out of money. That's the only way to put it. And unless we start making difficult trade-off decisions around what we spend public money on, how we facilitate growth in the economy, then we're not going to get out of this crisis. VAT debate has been all very interesting, but like I said in the beginning, 15 billion rand, it's a lot of money, obviously. We must take it seriously. But in the broader context of government spending, it's really tiny. And if growth is going to be cratering in a uncertain global economy, and because of domestic factors, that's really going to exacerbate some of these problems. So, I think we need to start getting serious about the state of public finances in this country.
Yeah, and I could just add to what David just said there. To me, the almost the real casualty of the fact that we've now reversed the VAT increase is the fact that it seems as though we've completely rejected any ideas of further reform. There was at least a discussion regarding the fact that there would be support for the budget provided that we see some pro-growth reforms. It seems like that's now completely gone by the wayside. It seems like we're not going to see anything that will actually solve the structural issues in South Africa. You mentioned there the growth rate. It's actually been, over a decade that we've had not just sluggish growth, but really actually closer to 2 decades that we've had really poor, almost below population growth, economic GDP growth. And I mean, that's not sustainable. That's why you see an increase in unemployment. That's why you see an increase in the pressure put on the budget. That's why you also see, hopefully not enough, but more pressure on the ministers that actually deliver the budget. I think that they've sort of coasted on their, they've been allowed to rest on what little bit of laurels they've actually had in the past in those first initial Mandela years, and in particular the Mbeki years, which actually went rather well, relatively speaking. But the fact is that it seems as though we're now not going to see those broader reforms that really are the only way to address it. And I know that you can sort of set it up as it's growth, cutting, or borrowing, or then increasing taxation. But I think something that's not talked about enough is just the fact that cutting isn't valuable in and of itself because it reduces the debt burden, or could reduce the debt burden. It's also valuable in that it actually facilitates growth. Spending less, or taxing less, having less government intervention isn't just valuable because it reduces the amount of money that we spend on the government. It's valuable because it can actually help to facilitate growth in the economy, and that really is what we need, and it's what we've not seen. And I think I've mentioned this in one of the previous episodes as well. But so far, one of the worst administrations has been the Ramaphosa administration for South Africa. People like to talk about Jacob Zuma, and I understand that there probably is still some fallout from a lot of the things that happened under Jacob Zuma's administration. But the fact is that some of the worst policies have come under Ramaphosa. So if we are talking about replacing people, it can't just be the finance minister. It actually has to be the man who has been president in South Africa that has seen the most dramatic increase in unemployment, the poorest performing growth rates in our democratic history, and the largest, or very close to the largest, ballooning of our debt. So there's almost not an issue that South Africans can raise that hasn't been at its worst during the Ramaphosa administration. So it's weird to me that there still seems to be all this positive sentiment towards the president himself, when in fact that's not borne out in any of the results. There's like I said, there's not a single metric that you can point to where you can say, we think that it's worthwhile keeping Ramaphosa because he's good at X, Y, or Z. You might have said that maybe he's good at diplomacy because he's so articulate and he's so measured and everything. But I think that so far this year so far has shown that certainly isn't the case anymore, if it ever was. So not just the finance minister, but I think we really have to take a look at if we are going to start chopping and changing, maybe starting at the top, because beyond the fact that there's good vibes from the president, I don't know what he's actually delivered. I can't really see anything that I can point to, and I invite people. If you can think of anything, put it in the comments, and I'd be happy to have a look at it. But as far as I can tell, things have only ever gotten worse, and they've gotten worse. In particular, they've accelerated under Ramaphosa. So let's if we are reconstituting the GNU, maybe that's where we start.
So, I mean, just on Ramaphosa briefly, I mean, I would say he's been entirely absent from this process. Where has his leadership been? I mean, this is a serious matter. I mean, I think he didn't attend the first budget speech because his plane was stuck in the airport due to inclement weather in Joburg. But, since then, he's hardly uttered a word. And I think that's consistent with his leadership style, which is actually kind of take a step back and let others do the fighting. But really what is required in the current context is strong leadership and a direction. But I think, the issues that he seems to care about don't really feature in terms of what the core priorities of what South Africa should be. So, so I think just as a bit of a sidebar, that has been kind of notable. He's been. I heard an anecdote the other day whilst I was meeting with some people that he was at a golf course in Limpopo, and that the guy that I was talking to was playing golf, and suddenly this private helicopter comes in, lots of disruption, fanfare, and lands on the fairway there, and the president emerges, gets escorted to his little golf cart, and goes and plays a one ball. So he was playing by himself, which maybe he should. Maybe he's practicing for his eventual trip to Mar-a-Lago, where he can try and convince Donald Trump to ease off on the hostilities. But I think that's an interesting metaphor. He's kind of isolated and alone. But meanwhile, South Africa is facing some really serious problems.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I mean, we discussed this in a previous episode about kind of what Ramaphosa is good at is to put it in its most positive light, is picking his battles. So he just stays away from what the fights that he thinks he can't come out of looking good. So this would have been one of them. And I mean, it's everyone participating in this discourse, it really looks like an asshat, because everyone is saying something that just probably doesn't make sense. For the DA, for instance, I think on this specific issue, the DA probably is doing the best, but it still has that added thing with the, I mean, I'm going to try and uncomplicate this as far as I possibly can, but it's very difficult. The DA, and Morné alluded to this, the DA accepted the VAT increase, provided that certain pro-growth reforms were made. The DA said in a letter that we are prepared to vote for this if the government adopts these pro-growth reforms. Now, that's very contrasted with the DA's public posture, which is, no to VAT, we won't accept VAT. I mean, these two things cannot coexist. If you're really completely against VAT, then it wouldn't matter if you want to do the trade-off. I think doing the trade-off is smart. I would take the trade-off personally. But the communications around this doesn't look good for the DA, and Action SA has made a lot of headway out of pointing this out, saying that, no, but the DA is lying to you. They actually were prepared to vote for that if they just had these progressive laws like expropriation without compensation and NHI and so on repealed. So the DA is actually also against you. But then Action SA, of course, I cannot imagine that there are any greater clowns coming out of this whole kind of issue than Action SA. The ANC is obviously ultimately to blame, but Action SA, their leader is a former chairman of the Free Market Foundation, right? Their leader is the guy who wrote The Capitalist Crusader. Their leader is who, I mean, effectively 10 years ago, we would have said is South Africa's Javier Milei. He is South Africa's Margaret Thatcher. He's the big thing that's coming, Herman Mashaba. And no, they responded to the DA attempt at a trade-off, at a negotiation, by saying you cannot do this. You cannot negotiate the budget. That was Action SA's kind of whole thing. It's like the DA tried to negotiate the budget. How dare they? They should have just said yes or no to the whole thing without negotiating. And then immediately Action SA itself is now parading around in discourse saying that they stuck around and negotiated the budget. So they got it. So they negotiated. But it's no one is coming out of this discourse, in my view, unscathed. I can't point to one political formation, one political party and say, they really struck that kind of balance of sensibility and of that little bit of populism that you need in a democracy. So I think a lot of this was probably in Ramaphosa's calculation as well. For him, it's all about his reputation, his image, and playing out kind of ANC factions against each other. And I think he came to the conclusion that the less I say, the better. And that's obviously the absolute worst thing for a so-called leader to do. Like, as you say, David, he actually has to kind of bite the bullet and get in and provide guidance to a very harmful episode, amongst many, as Morné points out, like probably the worst administration in post-apartheid South Africa as far as policy health and polity health is concerned, and he just lets it get infinitely worse because he wants to protect his own idea, at least, of his own prestige in our politics. So he's very good at picking his battles. It's very bad for us, although there's always a question mark. If he got involved, would he have provided good leadership, or would he have just made the whole thing even worse? Morné, I see you have.
Does he actually do a good job of picking his battles, or does he just avoid every single battle? Because that's what it feels like to me, is that he just doesn't enter into battle ever. He's a sort of, you can't get in trouble if you never articulate any position. That sort of feels to me, at least, what Ramaphosa's been doing is just never taking a clear position on anything, and that's not clever strategery. That's just him saying, okay, you guys sort it out, and I'll just go with whoever wins the argument. That's what it feels like to me, at least. I can't think of any. Can you think of any battles that he really entered into and
I would say that's mostly outcome? Right. Well, okay, no, you've added a proviso there about a positive outcome.
Well, from his perspective, a positive outcome. Something that he would have said. Yeah,
I would say the battle of the US. He's gotten very involved in that, and I think he thinks it's reflecting very well on him. This kind of lone leader in the world who's saying no to Donald Trump, and everyone else is conceding, and Cyril Ramaphosa is the man. He's the one saying, Trump, no, you will not take our sovereignty. So it does seem to me that Ramaphosa he's clearly not stayed out of that battle. He's not trying to remain kind of, well, maybe we should concede, maybe we shouldn't. I think he's very clearly said, no, South Africa is going to stick to its guns. And I mean, he's never in the past kind of minced his words when speaking about the US. So I think that's one. And I think the other one is probably lockdown. He was clearly forced into that kind of. It probably wouldn't have been possible for him to stay out of that. But he came out of that, and certainly none of us think this, but he came out of that as the decisive leader who provided great stewardship to South Africa during this very turbulent and uncertain time. And he probably feels quite chuffed with himself with how he approached lockdown. So I agree with you completely. I would just say that those are maybe the two only examples that I can think of where he actually waded in kind of at a very kind of specific level, and then the rest you're right, he just kind of avoids the question entirely.
I think you can add expropriation without compensation to that list. I mean, he said that this is correcting the original sin in South Africa. And I think one of the big perception problems that South Africa has with regards to Mr. Ramaphosa is that he has this image of this frustrated reformer, like he's kind of like this practical businessman type of character who just wants to drive through reform. I mean, I still have conversations like this to this day. But that, he's got this very difficult balancing act within the party. There's all these radicals and recalcitrant trade unionists who just won't let him get on with the business. But I mean, if you just look at what he puts his backing behind, I mean, expropriation, NHI, I mean, I think he believes this stuff. I think he's a socialist in his worldview, and a nationalist as well. But yeah, I don't think he's acting in the national interest at all. And yeah, it's kind of interesting and amazing to me. I think, Morné's question was really quite an insightful one, which is, how has he been able to get to the top, to climb the slippery pole of South African politics? I mean, is it just the case that he's the kind of the least offensive guy in the room, somebody that not really disagreeable, so he kind of ends up rising to the top? Is he failing upwards, or is he actually an extremely cunning fox of a character who's been able to manipulate his way? I'm not sure, but I think people underestimate him, and he's very good at political survival. I don't think that necessarily means he's an effective politician in terms of what's good for the country, but seems to be very good at keeping his head above the parapet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I'll agree with David, right? The two. He's a good politician, but he's not a good political actor for for South Africans. He can stay alive politically, but yeah, his policies are horrible. I think a lot of the ANC's old guard, going back to Tito Mboweni, right, and a lot of these ministers who had power during Mbeki's years, as Morné was talking about, is that they ideologically they believe in these things. That is why Ramaphosa will never be opposed to the NHI. That is why the health minister is so vociferous in his promotion of the NHI, and no one in the ANC, because to them it's an ideological issue. Same with EWC. So I also agree with Morné too. He doesn't seem like the most confrontational of guys, right? Like if you were to contrast him with someone like Jacob Zuma, for instance, like their level of operation, or their manner of operation, is different, right? Seems more reserved, seems more unassuming, right? That way, it means that he doesn't get to step on a lot of toes because he never really puts himself out there. And then, contrasted with our former president, he was a singer, he sang at rallies, he danced, and all of these things. So, like that, I guess, helps him stay alive, I think. That and a mixture of his competency in terms of politics. But yeah, as far as him being good for the country, I agree with David fully. His policies have been quite horrible. His presidency is the worst, right? He gave us lockdown. I will never forgive that. Lockdown for me, as I will forever reiterate, changed everything in how I view the state. It just reaffirmed a lot of the things that I held, and he was the one at the forefront of that. He pretty much puts people under house arrest, and I can't imagine if Jacob Zuma was president and he had ordered something like that, the country would have probably revolted, even including the media itself. So yeah. His presidency has not been the best. The metrics are there, and the disheartening thing is that he's the president of the biggest party in the GNU, meaning that's really the only chance we have of him being voted out of power, as if at the next ANC conference a new president comes in and then they could recall him before his term ends, like every other ANC president has had. So yeah, that's our best hope of the change that we need, really, in terms of accountability, because his tenure has not been good. And when we're saying this, and this is his second term, right? Meaning we are screwed, for lack of a better term, because we lived through his first term, and a large portion of our fellow South Africans were like, nah, it's okay, let's give this guy another chance. So yeah, it is quite disheartening, and also upsetting. But I'm still optimistic. We can only hope.
Yeah, and I think that even from a pure ANC perspective, you can't see his presidency as a success. I mean, he was president when they finally fell below 50% and significantly below 50%. And insofar as those new polls from the IRR and the SRF are reliable, it seems as though he's overseen an even further drop in ANC support. So even from their perspective, he's not. You can't regard him as a success at all. And I think, just take it back to whether or not he's been effective, either personally or politically. To me, he sort of gets away with being the blandest and most inoffensive. He's sort of the vanilla politician where, nobody gets upset with vanilla. It's not really got much flavor, but it's sort of fine. Nobody's going to be offended if you give them vanilla, but it's also not going to really do much for you. And that's sort of his biggest strength, is that he's hollow. He doesn't really give you anything to either criticize or to praise. He just sort of keeps taking not even the middle ground, but refusing to take a ground. I mean, even those two things that we've mentioned, what is it, the lockdown on the one hand, pandemic, and the Trump thing, the raucous with the US. Even on those points, I mean, it's not as though he took charge of the pandemic response. He handed that over to NDZ. So, I mean, most of the ire was directed towards her. And with the US, he's also been, for the most part, silent, and he's been happy to have the rest of his cabinet actually react, despite the fact that they've been very poor in the reactions. But yeah, so I mean, yeah, to me, he just skates by not really taking any position, and hoping that if he doesn't take a position, that the media will sort of enter into that space and say, okay, well, he hasn't taken a position, so I guess he agrees with my position, and let me tell you what I think he thinks. And then we're supposed to be happy with that. Although I do think that even that initial gloss that he had, that's either really declining or it's gone by now. I don't think he has nearly the shine that he had initially, and if he has any shine left at all. So yeah, I mean that's on Ramaphosa, but the question is, I suppose, that what would a new leader look like? And I sort of agree with Zakes that it's not necessarily a better leader doesn't necessarily lead to better outcomes. I think you could actually have a situation where you have a very unpopular leader who doesn't really manage to get all of these damaging policies through because nobody trusts him. If you had EWC or NHI or even Bala or a lot of those policies under Zuma, I don't think they'd have been able to get them through because everybody would have said, no, we can't trust these guys to do that. So it's not going to happen. And it's the sort of trust that we had in Ramaphosa that allowed him to get a lot of the policies through. So I guess I'm calling for worse leadership in the ANC, and trusting that what's bad for them is good for South Africa.
Yeah, and I think they're calling that because as much as they can't claim Ramaphosa as a success, that Ramaphosa is all that they have to offer. I don't think any other ANC politician is nearly as popular as Ramaphosa is anymore, and Ramaphosa is, last I heard, very unpopular. So I think the polls show. I don't know if the recent one has shown this, but even though the ANC is declining rapidly, without Ramaphosa, it's basically destroyed. It's gone. It becomes a normal small party in South Africa, kind of hovering around the 20% mark. So yeah, I think even though the party won't call him a success, they do realize that he is their biggest selling point. And yeah, I mean, I agree with you, Morné. Ramaphosa, in my mind at least, fits in with that. It's a group of kind of international leaders into which I would classify Justin Trudeau, Jacinda Ardern. These are charismatic, and I would say young. Ramaphosa is very old, but for some reason I always thought he was much younger, and he seemed to be kind of a polished kind of guy who seemed to have energy in a certain way, but the guy he's the oldest, I think one of the oldest members of the cabinet, so he's very old, but I would still classify him as part of that group of charismatic, well-spoken leaders who if you peer beneath the surface, are providing a good, very respectable kind of facade for tyranny, effectively. I mean, I don't think we have to think a lot about how lockdown would have progressed under Zuma. You wouldn't have had Adrian Basson calling him majestic, or kind of people saying, "Oh, it's decisive leadership." They would have said, "This is a complete and unmitigated disaster of humanitarian crisis that this president is kind of forcing out this country into." And there's value in that. There's a lot of value in that. Leon Lowe always used to say that Zuma is the best president that South Africa could ever have had from a libertarian perspective, because he was doing a lot of hard work that we should have been doing, but that we tend to fail in, at delegitimizing the state. And that was kind of Zuma's great appeal. Like, every time he opened his mouth, everyone cringed a little bit about, ugh, what is this guy going to do now to hurt us? And with Ramaphosa, we've given that benefit of the doubt, which David alluded to this earlier, that he still has conversations to this day. And I think all of us experience this in, call it, polite company. People are just like, oh yeah, he's really trying, and he really wants to do good, and we just have to give him that mandate. Looking at you, Peter Bruce, you still have that mentality, despite the mountain of evidence being that this is not the reality of the man that we're dealing with. And he's not even up for re-election, so we don't even have to give him this benefit of the doubt anymore. So it's actually quite bizarre. But yeah, I mean, he is all the ANC really has. I don't think they have any other leader who can legitimize what they're doing quite as well as Ramaphosa can. I think, Zakes, are you gearing up for?
No, not really. I was just agreeing with you. Yeah, I wouldn't say the ANC doesn't have any other leader for now, because the ANC is a very huge church, right? But I would think for the faction that Ramaphosa represents, which is the centrist-ish faction, he is arguably their best, right? Because the radical faction pretty much left with MKP. So I guess you could say that the ANC, he's their best option. But I don't know, man. I respect him politically in what he has managed to achieve in South Africa, like in getting to where he was. He has outmaneuvered a lot of politicians who are considered smart, but also I find his entire reign to be just one of the worst, really. It is one of the worst, and it is not even comparable. And to me, this is what is disheartening, because beyond just South Africa, African leaders in general, they have such great political acumen. They have this ability to be able to read politics and maneuver their political opponents, some to the extent of even having, dictatorships that span decades, right, in the Machiavellian sense, to maintain tyranny for such a long time. It should take some level of competence at least. But the thing is that this competence does not necessarily translate to the betterment of their societies. And this contrast, this is one of the things that bothers me the most, in that we have political animals on the African continent, but their politics is very basic. It is quite shallow, because even the things that they politicize about, really, it's just self-enrichment. There's no greater vision out there. And every time they try to have a greater vision, even if you may disagree with said greater vision, it is just for the purpose of self-enrichment. It's for the purpose of, self-fulfillment. And that is what breaks me the most. And I think Ramaphosa represents that in the worst of ways. Zuma represented the whole, he has a grand vision and he's going to use it for self-enrichment. Ramaphosa is, he's just a political animal, full stop. He believes in nothing. As Morné would say, he's not against anything, does not believe in anything. He just wants to be in power. He is in power. He has managed to be in power, and of course with the ancillary of self-enrichment too. So it's like, yeah, he's the worst of both worlds, and it is disheartening. But the broader point is that our politics is sad in Africa. Like, man, this conversation just made me a bit sad. So yeah.
Zakes, what do you make of someone, because there have been some names thrown around in the ANC. One is obviously Paul Mashatile, the deputy president, and that's sort of been the norm. The other one
That's
is
true.
Fikile Mbalula. And I was actually, my question is, what do you make of him? Because he sort of seems to me like the prototypical sort of mercenary politician that he'll really just he's willing to take a position, and he's open for it to take any position, provided it'll actually redound to his benefit. What do you make of it? Because I think that that's sort of more, because at least he's open to it. I mean, what's the old Stalinist distinction between on the one hand you have the sectarians, and on the other hand you have the opportunists. And the sectarians are ideology above everything else, and the opportunists are, I just want to enrich myself, regardless of ideology. I'd probably place him more on the opportunist side. And is that necessarily worse for South Africa from a policy perspective, to have someone who's actually willing to horse trade on these kinds of policies? Or if not him, is there anybody that you can see just shifting that away from I'm ANC first and then South Africa second, or even if it's not that, if it's I see that our ANC fortunes are more aligned with South Africa's fortunes than previously thought, or are we just sort of talking about do we have some sort of status quo bias, and we are actually going to see a different party with the plurality of the votes in the next election?
In the next election.
What's your feeling there?
Yeah. I think your last point. I think we may see a plural. I'm hoping for plurality. That would be the best outcome, right? When no singular party, particularly the ones on the left, get a large majority. But on the point of Fikile Mbalula, I think I always use past experience, even though I hate empiricism in any other instance. But I think when it comes to human beings, it's a good indicator of how they act. And in Mr. Mbalula's tenure as sports minister. Yeah, I think it should be able to tell us what he'd be willing to do, and as if he were to become ANC leader. And the thing is with ANC leaders, right, is that their opportunism isn't an opportunism that would see them willing to accept reform, to accept things that would be quite beneficial for the country, because you see the ANC is built in such a way that it isn't accountable to South Africans. It isn't even accountable to its branches, given the nature of its constitution, right? The highest decision-making body between conferences is the NEC, meaning that even if you could have a majority of branches unhappy with a particular ANC leader, and they would not be able to do anything about it unless the NEC recalls that leader, because the NEC is the highest decision-making body. It is one of the absurd things. I'm thinking of studying it long term, the nature of the ANC itself. So his opportunism would only extend so far as his position in the ANC is not compromised, particularly his position in the NEC. And that's what all ANC leaders really have been willing to do, including Mbeki himself, right? Like Mbeki, who had the greatest economic growth under his tenure, but we also had pretty much an institutionalization of welfare statism. Like that was when it became a thing. We are now a welfare state with cash payouts and everything. So this balance with ANC leaders is what we should always, be wary of. And with Mbeki, the reason that it turned out to be, relatively good was that he was what you would call a sectarian, right? So I guess if I were to choose someone, right, I would choose a sectarian. Mbeki was a sectarian in that he genuinely believed in this whole mixed economic model of having a state that had capacity with also free markets being able to generate revenue. He genuinely believed in those things, and as such, this is what drove at least his personal ambition. That is why it's better to have sectarians. Pure opportunists like Fikile Mbalula will pretty much just do whatever the NEC says should be done. And if the NEC is leaning towards a leftist position, then it means that he would be willing to do anything to protect that leftist position. And if he was ever willing to horse trade, really, it would not be in a meaningful manner. So yeah, I'm not the biggest fan. Like you mentioned, Fikile Mbalula, I think he'd be the worst option. Really, he'd be the worst option. So a sectarian would be better. I know there are rumblings of I think Ronald Lamula having a higher position going to conference. He's a sectarian. He's an ideologue. I don't think of the uber Marxist kind, but he is an ideologue of some variety, right? He always seems to be operating from a position of semblance of vision, which is, something you don't usually see from ANC leaders. So out of the current ones in leadership positions, he would be the best one. I don't think he would necessarily be the one because, as you said, the convention is that deputy presidents are usually, the ones who step into the presidential position. But I think with Paul Mashatile, right, like I think News 24 has an entire investigation on him during his tenure in Gauteng. He does not have the greatest track record, but I don't think that has ever dissuaded ANC branches from voting for people. So yeah, I would prefer
That's the
Ronald.
other tradition, is that you have to have a few
Yeah,
investigations to
so
qualify. That's sort of
then,
like the entrance fee.
yeah. Then it does not bode well for my, hoping that Mr. Lamula would be the one to lead it, because yeah, he does not seemingly have the level of scandals that Mr. Mashatile has. So yeah, it should be interesting. But I'm genuinely hoping for plurality. I'm hoping that the trend that we saw of the ANC losing its votes and other parties getting the votes, I prefer it. Of course, it presents us with this uncertainty of the budget as we are experiencing right now. But if it means that the ANC could not just ram through whatever they want to ram through, then I think it is a net positive over the medium to long term.
Yeah, and I think the key thing here, I mean, as we wrap up this part of the conversation, is that in our coalition politics, the uncertainty around the budget should actually be a good thing. It should be something that gets us excited. I think Morné has spoken about this kind of before, in that it shouldn't just be that whatever the ANC, I think they call it the Economic Transformation Committee, that's their economic policy kind of institution. It shouldn't just be that whatever they come up with is South Africa's next budget. We should rather have this kind of give and take negotiation, Parliament actually flexing its muscles, the finance committee, without people saying, oh no, you're not allowed to negotiate the budget, like as if, my God, Michael Beaumont, my goodness. But that is what we want. So that we want that sprinkling of uncertainty. But this is our first rodeo, really, with this. And I don't think our response, which is the response of many, make no mistake, is that, oh goodness, let's just get back to having a party with an outright majority. I mean, even the DA, they dream of being the outright majority governing party of South Africa, and I think that's not necessarily something we should get excited about. This system that we have has some benefits once you develop a political culture around it. When you develop this political culture of compromise and of give and take, then no one having an outright majority is actually a good thing. And the other area in which it will benefit us, hopefully in the future, when maybe after the next election, the ANC finally realizes that it is no longer the governing party, is in foreign policy. I think last week or the week before that, we discussed Sabini Jonas being sent to the US as a special envoy, kind of just as Ramaphosa's next insult to Donald Trump. But since then, I don't know if the presidency has confirmed this, but apparently there is a list of a bunch of has been Afrikaners being considered as the next kind of formal South African ambassador to the United States. And I mean, it's such a weird calculation that from this whole thing that's gone on since January, what the ANC seems to have concluded is, no, the Americans are offended because we send them black ambassadors, and we can just solve this if we send them a white ambassador. That would be the thing. I mean, good lord, man. And then they pick this lineup of, I mean, one of them I thought was dead, Martinez van Schalkwyk. Like I read a book about the history of the New National Party about a year ago now, and I was interested to find out, where is this man, and I just couldn't find it. Like, he was just gone from the face of the earth after he left as tourism minister. But someone has now pointed out that he is, in fact, our ambassador to Australia. Because of course he is. I mean, that just makes so much sense to me now. But it's Martinez van Schalkwyk, who was the leader of the New National Party. He tried to merge with the DP back then. He abandoned that and then merged into the ANC. The other one, biggest other name is Rolf Meyer. He's one of the Verlichtes from the old National Party, who was the chief negotiator during CODESA for the National Party. He made a complete pig's breakfast of the NP's participation in the CODESA negotiations. He was basically Sir Ramaphosa's bitch. And then the others, I think there's one of the Kroonhoofs, I don't know which one. There's a daddy and a son. One was a National Party bigwig who later on became a political prostitute, and then now his son is kind of more or less in the same position. I think he's an NEC member of the ANC. And then there's the Deputy Minister of Justice, who used to be John Jeffries, but now it's Andries Now, I think is his name, and he's also a bigwig in the ANC. So these are the kind of, I don't know if there's anyone else, but these are the four kind of window dressing white faces that apparently, I don't know if the presidency confirmed this, that are being considered for US ambassador. And I saw a headline that some people in the ANC are very upset about this, which, I mean, of course they are. But yeah, I mean, obviously this, in my view, and I'll throw it to the panel now, this is obviously not the issue. The issue isn't who the ambassador is. You shouldn't have a completely insulting ambassador. But the issue is, what is South Africa doing domestically, number one, and maybe less importantly, but more importantly, what South Africa is doing vis-a-vis the United States, which is the kind of role that the ambassador must fulfill, is to maintain this relationship. And that is going to be the issue. You can send the best, kind of most pro-American ambassador to the United States, and I'm sure Trump will invite him for golf, and I'm sure they'll be friends and they'll retweet each other on X. But US policy towards South Africa is not going to change just based on that. The Americans are going to look for some substantive change in policy. But yeah, I would like to get your guys' thoughts on, if you have any, on who these personalities are, these people that are being considered for US ambassador and South African ambassador to the United States, and whether you think this is going to make any tangible difference.
Well, I think you
David?
said it there, Martin. The real issue is the policy, not the personality. And all of those names that you mentioned, to varying degrees, are somehow within the ANC universe. I mean, Martinus van Schalkwyk was an ANC member. I think Rolf Meyer was as well. And Meyer actually was very close to Ramaphosa after the negotiations. And I think they even started a consulting company together called Fever Tree. So very much intertwined interests. But yeah, so it surprises me that members of the ANC are upset about this, because all of them look like ANC cadres to me. But, I think that really, I think you could send Mother Teresa to be the ambassador of South Africa to the United States. And without a policy change, she's going to get nowhere. So, I think there needs to be a hard diplomatic reset on that relationship for there to be any headway. It's not just about the personnel.
Yeah, I think, at the risk of repeating what both of you have said, on the list of things that the US has identified that have caused, from their perspective, the relationship to sour, not one of those was, the particular person who's in the position of ambassador. This sort of just got into the spotlight because the previous ambassador made such a horrible mess of it. But so obviously it's not gonna have a huge effect. The other point that I think is just worth mentioning is that this is sort of the ultimate kind of version of projection, like a ideological projection from the ANC, where they sort of assume that because they are obsessed with representativity, and they're obsessed with having the right skin color and all those sorts of things, that means that everybody else is as well. That means that the ANC only really cares about race and gender and all those sorts of things. So that must mean that everybody else in the world thinks the same way. So as long as we send an Afrikaner guy, then they'll be happy, as though that is how everybody else thinks. And I mean, that's just a contrast that you see throughout policy. And it's actually weird that Trump has gotten so much flack on this. But I mean, if you just look at what he's done on DEI versus what South Africa is doing with regard to BEE and all those things, in particular affirmative action, which now seems to be really ramping up. You have two different countries. You have one country that says, if we find out that you're discriminating against people based on race, then we don't want to do business with you. So we're going to cancel our contracts. We're not going to provide funding. We're not going to, we're not going to enter into an agreement with you in the future. That's one country. The other country says, if we find out you're not discriminating, we refuse to do business with you. We're not going to give you any contracts. You better discriminate if you want to do business with us. And for some reason, people seem to think that the second one of those two options is the more moral one. The government that says we demand businesses discriminate on the basis of race and gender and all those things, as opposed to the one that says we demand that they don't. For some reason, that's the bad news here. But yeah, I mean, that's just the same thing that you see. You can see it's sort of the driving force behind almost everything that the ANC does, and they view the world through those glasses. That's the only one. That's the only thing that they can see, and then they sort of project that onto everybody else. They think that because that's our highest priority, it has to be the highest priority of everybody else. And I think that they're actually going to get a surprise in that regard. And I think they're going to find out that no, other people actually have other priorities. And it's not that you're representing some sort of universal norm. It's that you're actually quite out of step with the rest of the world regarding these sorts of things. And I think that I think that the rest of the world is going to start waking up to this. It hasn't just been the US that has been critical. There have been various institutions and investors and some of those international organizations that make of them what you will. But there's been a broader kind of critique of our race-based policy regime. And I don't think that using a race-based appointment regime for ambassadors is gonna help that any.
Yeah, I mean, great points, man. My initial point still stands. The reason we're in trouble with the US is because of Israel. So really everything is moot when compared to that. The Americans did not have a problem when BE was first passed in 2008, when affirmative action was first passed in the mid-2000s. When all of these things were happening, they were still investing. They were still bringing their capital here. All the international organizations you speak of, Morné, were still dealing with South Africa. Things only started changing when we took Israel to the ICJ. That is the turning point, at least in my humble opinion. So really, of course, I agree with you, would like to see domestic policy change. The ANC, I think on their side, right, they're like, hey, these guys in their, and this whole Trump anti-DEI thing is is interesting. I hope we commit an entire podcast episode to it, because I love the principle, right, in mind. And then you see the people who support said things, and then you see the things they advocate for, right? And then you look at, like I was reading, I listened to a lot of military podcasts, just as a minor tangent concerning Trump's DEI thing. And in this, they were clearing out books in the, I think, some military library in West Point, right? And they were saying they should remove all books that have mention of, DEI or, minorities or things like that, in the whole spirit of just clearing the American consciousness of such things. And, they did this, and as they were removing these books, including books, of course, by Black American authors and things like that, books like Mein Kampf weren't removed, of course. And there's a big kerfuffle about this in like that American newspapers have, made mention of. I'm sure if you Google the story, you'd find. But I think that is telling. That is telling in the approach to DI that the Americans have. And I think it's disingenuous for anyone to be like, oh no, Donald Trump and those Southern conservative Republicans just want everyone to be equal. That's why they want all these books by black authors to be removed, and we leave Mein Kampf there because ain't nothing wrong with that. Mention transgenderism, then mention slavery in your curriculum, then we have a problem, you DEI proponents. So that is that concerning the Americans and their approach to DEI, but really concerning the South Africa's appointment, right? And their choice of ambassadors and whether it will have an effect or not. It will depend on whether these ambassadors will be willing to tell the US be willing to tell Israel what it wants to hear through the US, which is we maybe will apologize. I don't know what Israel wants because the cases already went to the ICJ. So I think this is a form of just punishment on their part. But yeah, in my estimation, we have to change the Israel situation. If we change the Israel situation, then I think the American situation miraculously will work out. Of course, we want to see domestic policy change, right? Because we don't want any form of preferential treatment being done by states when everyone pays taxes equally, right? So that definitely we do want. But let us not act, at least in my estimation, like the Americans are bothered by that because they weren't. We had these policies for years and they were never a problem for them until we took Israel to the ICJ. But yeah, that's
there's another variable, Zakes, which is Donald Trump himself, right? I mean,
yeah, he's in his second term. He's in his second term. His first term, he did not have any of this. So the variable that is actually what proves the point for me, is that this very same president was in office previously and he did not do any of this because there was no ICJ case. The only thing that has changed between now and then is the ICJ case. Of course, we can choose to be oblivious to it, but to me, it seems super obvious.
Look, I mean, I don't think that's entirely correct. I mean, you might recall in 2019, then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo delivered a speech in Addis Ababa to the African Union, where he specifically pointed out the danger and the risk of expropriation without compensation, and that South Africa was threatening private property rights. So, and look, I think there was a comment in the comments, I think it was from one of 44, to say there has been a notable step change in, I mean, the Trump administration seems to be a lot more coherent in terms of its, the composition of the cabinet, the framework, the agenda that they're pursuing. You might have question marks about the benefits or the shortcomings of that agenda, but it is a lot more targeted. I mean, USAID survived the first Trump administration, but hasn't survived the second. So, I think you do need to kind of acknowledge that step change. But I mean, the Biden administration didn't seem to take any sanctions or steps against South Africa after the ICJ case. So, they kind of preferred more treading softly kind of approach with SA. So I think it's a bit more of a nuanced picture.
Yeah, I do think what's clear to me is that the Israel thing is, to the Americans, the most important issue. I think it's the most important issue in their relationship with South Africa. I disagree that it's the issue, that it's basically the only issue. I think it's certainly the most important one by a country mile, I would say. Because we don't represent much to the Americans economically. I think Franz Corneille often makes a good point about our strategic location in Africa, and I think there's a lot to be said about that. But that's not an insurmountable issue for the Americans, who basically have floating cities that they can take their strategic advantage with them wherever they need to go. So I don't think that's the big issue. I think that Zakes is right to identify Israel as at least the domineering issue, but Trump's kind of half-hearted intervention on EWC and Pompeo's half-hearted intervention on EWC in 2018, that does indicate that to some degree, this is on their radar. Our domestic policies, to some degree, do feature as something that the Americans think about, not because, well, we're South Africa. I think that they have their State Department as entire bureaus dedicated to kind of the various regions of the world. And when they find bad policy, I think that the Americans do take note of that, and they engage on that basis with their own companies and investors and so on. And I think the fact that the Trump I think in our first episode of this podcast, or I mentioned something that the Trump administration is, in a sense, more open to kind of just random people kind of walking in and kind of giving their grievances. And Elon Musk, in my mind, kind of represents this to some degree. He's this businessman. You don't really know if he works for the federal government or not. No one can really answer that question. But he's this effectively a random guy who always been rich, but until relatively recently was a political unknown. Just kind of now having outsized influence in America, and this is not terribly commonplace, I would say, at least not in this sense. And kind of Trump speaking to Rogan and so on. So there's a sense of an openness to kind of look at kind of stuff happening in the world and in America that the American government in the past didn't really look at. And I think what Zake's identified a bit earlier is that this is not necessarily just a good thing. I mean, there's this, it's not just, oh, great, it's a more transparent government, and they're more open, and they're fighting against DEI and kind of transformationism, well, what we would call in South Africa. No, there's something of an overcorrection occurring where they turned around, they went past non-racialism, and then they ended up on the other side of it, and just kind of are doing some things that I agree with Zakes are economically on tariffs. I mean, obviously is dumb, but removing kind of those notices of black servicemen who kind of were heroes in wars and so on, and at least there's a question mark around why are they doing this? Like, the word black doesn't trigger necessarily like that it's DEI or anything like that. So there is an overcorrection, and you see this in the culture. I think you see this in the political discourse as well. There's the Republicans, the party of limited government and free markets. I mean, good Lord, man. Geez, if Twitter is now the new kind of marketplace of ideas, and I'm seeing a lot of Republicans on there, it's not looking good, man. It's looking quite bad nowadays for values of limited government, of free trade, and all these things. And so yeah, this is not all good. But someone recently, an American, a close friend of the FMF, very recently said that, listen, your estimation of Trump really shouldn't matter. The fact is, there is an opportunity now to try and get some good things for South Africa to out of this change in pace in America. And as someone who, I mean, there's so much that I can object to that Donald Trump is doing domestically in the US and as far as trade is concerned with the rest of the world. But I still think that we need to see this as an opportunity. And last week we spoke about realigning South Africa into a more neutral foreign policy, which I think will be cool with the Americans. I don't think they necessarily want a outright pro-American foreign policy, and I think they'll accept neutrality. And trying as far as we can to use that pressure to leverage domestic change. But yeah, let's wrap it up. I'll give everyone kind of a last word. Let's start with Zakes, Morné, and David, and then I'll close.
Yeah. Well, to end it all off, I agree. We should always try and put more pressure, right? We want to see the world change, and whenever we are given opportunities to change the world, irrespective of where they come from, we should always take them. And yeah, we live in an interesting time. I am usually an idealist. I am always an idealist, and I find times of great chaos and upheaval to be quite illuminating, because they show the best of us and the worst of us. So, we just have to keep on keeping on, guided by our wonderful, wonderful principles. But yeah, as for the South African and US situation, it's interesting. And particularly in the US, I think they are experiencing something that is quite great, I don't think they'll realize until much more later. Whether the greatness will yield good consequences or not is not particularly great. For the Black community specifically in the United States, I think this is an environment that has not been seen there, I think, since you would say the 60s, 70s, in terms of the cultural milieu and how they are viewed. And Morné, I see him squinting his eyes because Morné thinks it's okay to take either way. This is a very great cultural environment for Black Americans, and I hope that they utilize it. You know, having a government and general culture that is, you know, at the very least hostile. I see it with the Afrikaner community in South Africa. It can encourage some great things. So I hope they do that. I hope they take some good lessons.
Yeah, I did squint my eyes. I'm not sure if I definitely not go as far back as the 60s. Definitely not.
Oh yeah,
so
okay.
we're seeing legislation that, I mean, I'm not aware of any legislation that's sort of segregating populations.
Not in terms of legislation, in terms of the cultural, like the actual consciousness of the general population in America. It is now acceptable, as Martin said, to find Black as a word that should not be mentioned in government anything.
Yeah, let me.
That form of cultural acceptance of that thing has not been seen since the 20th century in America.
Yeah, let me just give a sort of a weak steel manning of that point, and that's just, you know, if you are trying to get rid of DEI, that means you're trying to get rid of the sort of emphasis on race generally. So that's why you'd remove not just references to Black, but references to white, references to any race. So if you really believe that race is irrelevant,
but they aren't doing that, though, Morné.
Then you're not going to remove anything that makes
but
race
they aren't
relevant.
doing that. But they aren't doing that. They're only removing references to Black. Like this is not even an issue. The reason they did not remove Mein Kampf is because it mentions race. Just, you know, the race they are comfortable with.
Yeah, but yeah,
this is the truth.
I haven't actually seen that. I haven't seen that story, so I can't really comment on that. But I'll take your word for it. Yeah, I think my last point would be, I guess, you know, don't throw stones if you live in a glass house. We you know, that we're doing some very bad things on our side as well. And I think we always have to keep that in mind, is that it's sometimes easier to criticize what other countries are doing because at the margin we don't agree, whilst at the same time we're doing that to the nth degree in our own country. And yeah, I think sometimes it's just fun to throw criticizing other people, despite the fact that we're actually doing far worse in our own country. So yeah, I think maybe just generally focusing on getting our own house in order wouldn't be the worst thing.
David.
Yeah, I'd say, you know, DEI has actually racialized political discourse, not just in America, but elsewhere. And I think moving towards non-racialism, I think, should be the goal. And certainly in my work, that's what I'm pushing for, treating people as individuals rather than as intrinsically members of groups, and, you know, focusing less on the melanin content in their skin and rather the content of their character. But yeah, just as a final statement, I want to say that for those of you who don't know, Rational Standard is not just for pod bros on a Friday at noon talking about the issues of the day, but it's also a website. So please do go to rationalstandard.com. Check out some of the great stories. The content that we're producing there, I think, is really high quality. You can access it via Substack or just via the website as well. There is a mechanism there that you can contribute financially. If you can't contribute financially, make sure to hit the subscribe button, share that content with your friends and family. And likewise for this podcast as well. We really want to help to spread the word of liberty and our unique and irreverent brand of political and economic commentary that is brought to you from the people at the Free Market Foundation. So yeah, please head on over and keep following us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks for that, David. I think the Rational Standard, we've written quite a bit on why we're doing this, and it basically comes down to the era of the mainstream press seemingly coming to a close, and we spoke about this in a previous podcast as well. And I think I've written something, Nicholas Wood-Smith has written something, Ayanda Zulu has written something, and David, I think you have an article coming out soon, very much on this topic, on Rational Standard, about what the thinking is behind cultivating a new voice in the press, and then certainly this podcast tries to also contribute to that. And I'm very happy to see that we every week, or there's some exceptions, but every week we seem to be growing in live viewers, and we currently have 20, and I see every now and then it jumps to 21 live viewers, and I think that's a very good crowd. That's what you'd expect for a nice medium-sized event at the Free Market Foundation. So thank you to all of you joining us right now. And please, if you've just joined us, don't be dissuaded. You can watch this show from the very top, and we would encourage you to do that. And of course, to everyone now going away for their long weekends. Some of you might have joined the 2 weekends together, and you have almost a little vacation to a whole week. So please enjoy that, and maybe take this podcast with you and listen to it as you sit on the beach, contemplating the direction that South Africa is going in and the world. And I hope you've gained some insights. We don't always all agree here on Rational Standard, and that's certainly not the point. We do think that there's value in having a liberal or a libertarian perspective, but also highlighting sometimes the disagreements within that perspective. We're not a hive mind, and unlike some political parties in South Africa that have totally bought into Lenin's democratic centralism, we're not going to do that. We hope you find some value in the debates that we have on here. But that's it from us for this week. Please remember to like this video. Please share it with your friends. And most importantly, on YouTube, please subscribe and ensure that you stay up to date on any future episodes. And as David said, please go to rationalstandard.com. There's various ways of you to follow us there. Subscribe on Substack, bookmark the page, and please also restack the articles that you enjoy there, so that other people on Substack can find them, and you can also, of course, share them on social media. But that's it from us, and we will see you again next week, same time, same place, and enjoy your weekend. Cheerio.